one of the nice things about this panel is that each of the talks is very regionally specific. So let me just tell you who we're going to hear from, and then I'm going to give you a little trailer, a 1-minute trailer, just to let you know what I'm excited about hearing about, and then we'll turn it over. We're going to do 15 minutes each in terms of presentation, then 45 minutes for discussion, so plenty of time for discussion, I hope. And then we're going to be really strict about time. So our speakers are Laura Gomez-Mera, who is from the University of Miami. Her full biography is in the little booklet. She's going to talk on trade cooperation in Latin America. Eric Ongole, hope I got that right, is from the African Center for Economic Transformation. He's going to talk about regional integration, trade integration in Africa. And Nader Habibe is from Brandeis University, and he'll talk about economic relationships between the Gulf, GCC, and emerging Asia. Should have memorized that one. Okay, so Laura, let me tell you what I love about Laura's paper. Adil said, don't be disgusted. I'm just going to give you 4 things, 4 questions. Look at these questions. So how does Latin American regional integration reflect political alliances within Latin America? I'm a Latin Americanist, so of course I'm thinking Chavez, Lula. I want to hear more about that. Do regional agreements allow for more first mover advantages for countries that might be at an advantage as Latin America opens up, say, to China? So is it easier if you have regional integration, intra-regional trade, for Brazil to get into Bolivia before China gets into Bolivia? Right? And how does this proliferation of trade agreements, I've never heard so many times the word spaghetti bowl, how does this proliferation of trade agreements affect the legal developments? We have so many trade agreements developing. Do we have consistency in our legal developments and our Latin American countries playing with that opportunity for, what is it you call it, forum shuffling, forum picking, right? Forum shopping, yes. So I'm really excited to hear about this in detail. Encourage you to read her paper. And then Eric is going to talk about the prospects for trade integration in Africa as a way of raising GDP, we hope. Africa, these are your numbers, right? Africa accounted for 3.5% of global exports in 1980. 3.5% of global exports in 1980, 2% in 2009. So just to motivate, there's a real issue here of how do we look to the South-South trade relationships as a way of fostering growth. Another little piece of data that you mentioned was 3% of access to the internet. So to what extent can regional integration in Africa promote development in Africa, particularly for landlocked countries? So in what form should it take? And then how does that affect Africa's trade relations with China, which right now are very heavily concentrated in oil and gold, and just really 5 countries, I think you mentioned. So we look forward to hearing more about that. I'm doing the movie trailer here, and then on to Nader's talk about the Gulf. The Gulf is obviously benefiting from the fact that it exports oil to China and to India, right? So how can Gulf countries work together to change those, to use the changing world dynamics to its advantage? How does integration or some kind of cooperation within the Gulf work? Is it possible to use China and India as a way of diversifying their economic structure? Obviously, they're very oil dependent, but as they move toward China, at least they're a little bit less economic crisis vulnerable. They didn't get caught as badly as they might have in this economic crisis because they have China and India. And then is investment possibly a way of diversifying? When you can't diversify your trade a lot, can you diversify your economic structure by using investments in construction, real estate, services, et cetera, as a way of diversifying your economy? So that's what's coming up. We're going to start with Laura, 15 minutes, okay, and then we'll move on to Eric.
Thank you very much. I need to figure out this. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction and for the preview of my paper. I'm going to talk about the evolution of trade and economic cooperation in Latin America, a little bit more broadly in the Americas and the Western Hemisphere. And specifically, I concentrate on the causes and consequences of the recent proliferation in different types of agreements that have been emerging in the Western Hemisphere. Just to give you an overview, I'll start by describing this changing landscape of regional economic cooperation in the Americas. Then I'll discuss a few competing explanations of what has driven this very active development of cooperation initiatives in the Americas, and I'll concentrate a bit more on discussing the consequences, not only in terms of the economic effects of the proliferation or the spaghetti bowl of agreements, but also in the way they have affected political relations within the region. And then I'll very briefly conclude. So, as you probably know, the Western Hemisphere has been very active in terms of regional economic integrations. Even before the end of the Cold War, 50s, 60s, there was a first wave of regionalism in the region or in the Western Hemisphere. Of course, the same happened in other parts of the world. Those projects that emerged in the post-war period were particularly related to the model of development that prevailed in the region at that time, the import substitution, industrialization, and were attempts by countries to enlarge markets and implement industrialization with exploiting the large regional markets. Those projects were not very successful, and they faded with time. They faced strong problems, or very deep problems of implementation and compliance. And then after, in the late 80s and early 90s, we see a resurgence of regional cooperation in the Americas. Several of the older regional agreements were revived or relaunched. Mercosur emerged in 91. Of course, we have NAFTA in 94. And these agreements were viewed as completely different from the previous wave of regional cooperation in the Americas, in the sense that they were seen as more compatible with the process of globalization. Many of these countries were simultaneously engaging in processes of unilateral trade liberalization and also participating in multilateral trade negotiations, and these regional agreements were part of this broader shift to market-oriented policies, and particularly which placed a lot of emphasis on trade liberalization. They were hence welcomed by both policymakers and scholars. They were typically referred to as open regionalism projects. A lot of talk about the new regionalism and the differences between these more open projects and more inclusive projects and the previous wave of agreements. And then what we see toward the end of the 90s and in the first decade of the 21st century is that many of these agreements started losing a bit of the vigor, and intra-regional trade levels faded as the countries in the region faced economic crisis. And we also see two other, as a result of several changes in the world economy and also in regional and domestic changes in Latin America, we see other types of agreements emerging. And so what I do in the paper is discuss three types of regional cooperation initiatives that coexist at present in the Western Hemisphere. On the one hand, we have these open regionalism blocs that were quite ambitious in their economic objectives and the trade objectives. They aspire to become customs unions or common markets, even though most of them fall short of those objectives. And we see after the failure of the free trade agreement of the Americas, which I didn't mention, but I did that in the paper, which was, as you probably know, launched by the United States and in an attempt to promote hemispheric-wide trade liberalization. as this project failed also to achieve its intended objectives, we see a shift in the Western Hemisphere, the U.S. promoting bilateral trade agreements with some countries in Central America and in South America. And we also see South American countries engaging in transcontinental regional agreements with high number of not only intra-regional bilateral trade agreements, but also bilateral trade agreements with other countries in the world. Some of these bilateral trade agreements were South-South, others were actually with more developed countries, so-called North-South or asymmetric trade agreements. This is just to show how the number of RTAs, and here I distinguish between free trade agreements and partial scope agreements, which were very popular during the 90s, has evolved in the last 2 decades. And finally, in addition to the 2 waves or groups or types of regional cooperation initiatives that I just mentioned, the open regionalism blocks of the 90s and the bilateral PTAs or preferential trading agreements, there's been a 3rd type of regional project that has emerged in the Western Hemisphere. This have been referred to as post-liberal projects in the sense to differentiate them from the open regionalism blocks. And here I'm referring mainly to the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americans, ALVA, or the South American Community of Nations, which eventually became the Union of South American Nations, the UNASUR. And these projects try to, which bring together a group of South American countries, they try to differentiate themselves from the emphasis on trade liberalization or free trade that the open regionalism blocks of the 90s privileged. And apart from emphasizing or reflecting a shift in the domestic agendas of many countries in the region, they sought to broaden the agenda of integration and to not only focus on commercial issues, but broader economic objectives such as energy or infrastructure. And in the case of ALVA, of course, there's a much clearer political and social dimension of integration. So as a result of all these different trends and the 3 trends that or 3 types of agreements, what we see in practice is an increasingly complex and dense environment of regional economic links in the Western Hemisphere. And this is something that some of you might be familiar with, but it sort of tries to capture that complexity of links within the Western Hemisphere and between or among countries in the region and other regions. And so as I was saying, the first thing I do in my paper is try to discuss what explains this changing landscape, and in particular, why has regional economic cooperation been so active and so dynamic, and what explains this proliferation of overlapping agreements. And I discussed different factors that can be seen as accounting for this trend. I start by looking at competitive economic pressures. I consider the well-known Baldwin's domino theory of regionalism, which emphasizes defensive economic incentives, and as countries that are left out, which emphasizes the effects, the trade diverting and investment diverting effects that the formation of one agreement has, and how that triggers incentives for exporters in third countries to try to lobby their governments to either join the agreement or form other agreements. And I argue that the evidence seems to show that that explanation is relevant for Latin America. But I also look at another author, Mark Munger, who's recently published a book on asymmetric trade agreements, and which emphasizes the importance of FDI in explaining trade, the formation of preferential trading agreements, especially this type of North-South agreements. And according to him, it's many times he kind of extends Baldwin's argument and highlights the incentives that multinational corporations that are involved in foreign direct investment in many countries have to sign agreements that would consolidate them first mover advantages and allow them to sort of leave out other competitors, other investors from third countries. And how these offensive incentives and these offensive agreements that are driven by multinational corporations' lobbying efforts triggered in turn defensive incentives or defensive agreements by other investors or other countries that are left out and also feel or have an interest now in negotiating another agreement. So he looks at the cases of course, NAFTA and how the NAFTA agreement led the EU and eventually Japan to seek agreements with Mexico. And then he looks at the case of Chile and how in that case it was European investors who had a particular stake or interest in the services sector in Chile and how that agreement, how they were instrumental in pushing for that preferential agreement and how that agreement eventually fostered defensive incentives for the US and eventually Japan to sign agreements with Chile. So that's one group of explanations that I consider, and then I argue that it's also important to look at the power dimension and power symmetries in the Western Hemisphere. And here it's not only important to look at the preferences and the role of the U.S. and how the strategic policy or trade policy of the U.S. has changed and how that has affected the changing landscape of trade and economic cooperation agreements in the Western Hemisphere. But I also argue that it's important to look at the role of regional powers, and specifically and especially Brazil, and how different attempts to balance, on the one hand, Brazil's own project of regional leadership has been very important in explaining South American integration, not only Mercosur, but broader South American integration, and how small countries that have faced this overlapping dynamics of overlapping interstate power symmetries. On the one hand, they face Brazil, on the other hand, the U.S., and could sometimes use those two types of asymmetries in their advantage. I also look at domestic political factors, but I only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to shift to the third part of the paper, where I look at the consequences of this proliferation of overlapping and very diverse type of agreements in the Western Hemisphere. And I argue that, well, these arguments about the economic consequences of complexity and the spaghetti bowl effect is well known, so I won't go into that, but what I do is I draw upon very recent literature in international relations theory that has looked at the effects of international regime complexity on international politics. And drawing on this work, and this literature highlights how the proliferation and density of different types of agreements in international governance could have various types of feedback effects, of competitive effects, which may work to actually improve and facilitate deeper cooperation and the effectiveness of the institutions, but could also undermine the role and functioning of institutions. So I apply that, and I identify 3 mechanisms through which I argue, but this is just sort of an exploration. I don't really go into the testing of the hypothesis very deeply, but I just provide some anecdotal evidence. First, one mechanism that I identify is this issue of legal fragmentation and rule ambiguity, and the fact that there's such a proliferation of different types of rules, and those different rules. I think to answer Anne's question, there has been quite a bit of divergence, not only in terms of rules of origins, but also in terms of the different dispute settlement mechanisms that are put in place. Each of these bilateral agreements have dispute settlement mechanisms, and the regional agreements have those as well. But yet countries can also use WTO dispute settlement mechanisms to deal with trade disputes within the region. So, for example, Argentina and Chile signed an economic complementation agreement in 1991, which contained a chapter with very loose but still existing dispute settlement mechanisms. Then Chile negotiated entry to Mercosur as an associate, well, an agreement with Mercosur as an associate member. That agreement also contains a dispute settlement mechanism. And yet, in the 90s, when there was a dispute between Chile and Argentina, Argentina first decided to use the regional mechanism contained in the agreement between Mercosur and Chile, and eventually, since Chile failed to observe the ruling which favored Argentina, Argentina decided to go to the WTO, and then the two countries have been starting disputes against each other within the WTO for some time. Well, this doesn't really talk or reflect the type of problem, but one of the issues, one of the arguments in the literature which I think needs to be explored in more depth is the extent to which this type of rule ambiguity and legal fragmentation can affect the politics of implementation, which has been an important issue in Latin American trade agreements always. And I show in the paper how, I think I have this, and how it's interesting to see how even though there's been variations across the main blocks, even though the trend in terms of the number of agreements signed by countries in the region has really increased, the levels of interregional trade have not increased as much. And in fact, if we look at specific times, in periods in time, it has decreased. If you look at 2005 to 2007, it's lower than 94 to 97. Very, very, very briefly, I'm sorry I'm taking so long. Other effects that I discuss in the paper are cross-institutional political strategies, such as forum shopping, that allow countries to choose the forum, and not only in terms of dispute settlement mechanisms, but also in terms of choosing issues and issues to negotiate about. That can also allow countries to not only to selectively implement agreements, but also to shift their attention back and forth, and as well as competition effects between the different agreements. So just to conclude, one of the points that also comes out of this analysis is how these cross-institutional political strategies and competition effects allow bigger countries like the US or Brazil to prevail in bilateral negotiations. And that's one of the problems that Latin American countries might face if this trend continues. And so one of the lessons of looking at this unintended consequences of the proliferation is that maybe these effects might work to undermine regional unity and hence to undermine the objective of closer Latin American cooperation. Sorry.
It's a really rich paper. Eric.
Yeah, my name is Eric, and I'm grateful to the Pardee Center for having me here, and also to all the Adil, Rachel, Elaine, and everyone. Well, I am talking about Africa, trade and economic integration, and I'll be looking at the trends, the patterns, and also take a look at the longer range prospects. Well, let me say from the beginning that there are lots of new initiatives going on in Africa today that shows that the future of South-South cooperation in Africa is very bright. The political leadership who are emerging are beginning to recognize this, and some of the challenges that we have found to really dampen the impact of regional integration is beginning to be worked on. Well, first of all, we know that Africa has a very long history of regional integration, and regional integration in the region is motivated by two reasons. The first one, of course, is politics, and that started long ago when most of the countries were emerging from colonial dictatorship and felt that there is need for unity to be able to really fight the colonial masters, as it were. And secondly, there was the economic imperatives where the countries feel, okay, because of the small size of the countries in the region, because of the challenges of landlockedness, which most of the countries are facing, because of the small market, there is need for them to come together to be able to, to integrate, to be able to form a bigger market, which will actually help them to be competitive more, in the world. Now, some of the benefits that the countries or the region as a whole believe they'll derive from economic integration includes economic diversification, structural transformation, technological development, productivity enhancement, and also that there will be economy of skills, and there will be improvement in competitiveness, and also that it will also assist the region to participate more in global economic activities than going individual. Well, to give a small picture, a good picture of what happens in Africa with respect to the nature and structure of regional economic agreements, this is what we have, which is similar to what we have in Latin America. It's a spaghetti bowl kind of regional economic agreements. And one thing we find out here actually is that it's only one country in Africa that belongs to just one regional economic agreement. Only just. Apart from that, you have a country like Swaziland that belongs to at least 4. So what we see here, therefore, is you see some countries belonging to 3, 2, in fact, about 51% of the 53 countries in Africa belongs to at least 2 regional integration agreements. And to some extent, this has been a very big challenge for improving regional integration in the region. And added to this challenge is the North-South kind of economic agreements, which has also increased in recent times, talking about NEPAD, AEC, ACP, EU, TIFA, and several other arrangements that tends to also complicate this existing complexity in regional economic agreements in the region. Now, let's begin by taking a look briefly at the nature of intra-African trade flows within the region. What we find out is that there has been tremendous rise. If we compare between 1980 and 2009, there's been tremendous rise in intra-African trade in terms of volume. Because while in 1980 it was just 6.5 billion, in 2009 it rose to 68.5 billion. That's quite phenomenal. Now, in terms of share anyway, Africa continues, intra-African trade remains very low, just 3%. It's been revolving around 3%. So even though there has been rise over time and it's been phenomenal, but in terms of share, it's quite low, revolves around 3%, implying therefore that trade with other regions of the world, and in most cases developed countries of the world, has risen perhaps much more than trade within the region. Now, if we disaggregate this to regional level, you'll observe that both for imports and exports, Eastern Africa is doing better, or is doing best, if you compare it with other countries. You'll observe, for instance, for exports that the Eastern Africa and Western Africa were at the same level in 1980. But while there's been a rise in the share of Eastern African intra-regional trade, or exports in particular, that of West Africa, fell for some time before it began to rise gradually. And one factor that I think is responsible for this is the influence of Kenya within the Eastern Africa. Kenya has a very strong force within the Eastern African region, such that some of the crude oil that were imported are refined in the country before being distributed to some of the countries around, some of them being landlocked countries. In addition to that, Kenya also has relatively strong manufacturing base. One very strong of these, you see some of their products which are produced within the country being exported to most of the Eastern African countries. And that tend to have actually support the belief that this issue of production fragmentation to some extent could be what is helping the region in actually having the higher share in regional integration, intra-African trade. Now, if we look across the major regional economic communities we have in the region, we have this picture. And one thing we find out here is that it looks as if the ECOWAS is having the highest share in terms of intra-regional trade. And it's amazing, and because I think Nigeria, of course, is the biggest economy here, followed by Cote d'Ivoire and then Ghana. Well, I guess before the recent crisis, Cote d'Ivoire was doing very well in terms of intra-regional trade. We know the nature of the Francophone countries. It was the big league that is actually, so it was high until very recently. So it's most likely to some extent that this could be driving the force. And again, if we go to Nigeria in recent times, there's been lots of activities between Nigeria and especially Ghana and a few other English-speaking countries within the West African region. And that most likely might be the factor that is driving this change. Now, we also go on to look at the relationship between Africa and other southern countries, as it were, in trade. And again, we have also seen that it has grown over time. But one thing we found out when you disaggregate this to between the developing countries, developing Asia and Latin American country, it is very clear that it is developing Asia that is driving the trend, as it were. You could see there that for Latin America, it's been relatively very low. And that's the question I'll pose to Laura, whether she has an answer to that. While the trade integration kind of between Africa and Latin America has been very, almost steady, as it were, until very recently, where we observe a very little shift. Now, when we go on to look at African South-South trade along the lines of regional economic communities or blocks, one thing we find out here is that COMESA and SADC COMESA especially, appears to be doing best. And of course, this is driven by South Africa, given the size of the country, not just within the SADC group of countries, but also entirely within Africa. And that actually sounds interesting. But if we go on now and talk briefly about investment, one thing that we see here is that when we're talking about Africa's relationship with other southern countries on investment, China was absolutely nowhere until very recent past. If you look at the trend here, you see that it was actually Korea and Taiwan that started the trend. Later, countries like Malaysia and Pakistan joined, but today, China is the main force. Now, one interesting thing is that if you look at China and its engagement in Africa, it's driven by just very few countries. Before now, it used to be a little broad-based, but until recently, when China started concentrating on natural resources, it appears as if we're beginning to witness a concentration, not just in terms of countries, but also in terms of products. And one thing we find out here is that if you take a look at the percentage share, for instance, of some countries in China's investment in Africa, we discover that one thing that appears to be clear is that South Africa, Mauritius, I mean to say, seems to be having the highest share, then followed by South Africa. So the point we see here, however, is that recently Angola is beginning to take over because of China's interest in natural resources, especially oil. And so the trend is gradually changing towards natural resource intensive. It's actually a focus on that. Now, before I talk about the impediments, if we also take a look at the nature of trade between Brazil and Africa, which is leading the Latin American countries. You also look at that of India and Africa. It is basically the same, concentrated in terms of countries, concentrated in terms of commodities, both in trade and also in investment. Now, let me just run through some of the challenges that we mentioned in the paper that had been the major impediments to regional integration in Africa. The first one of them, which is the diagram we showed earlier, is the overlapping membership of the regional integration communities. There's also program duplication, where being members of several regional economic communities, you are forced to also implement several programs, in some cases contradictory programs. This has also limited the extent to which the countries can be integrated. There's also weak legislative and legal institutions, mechanism for enforcing them. We have weak national and regional economic institutions. There's lack of political will on the part of the political leaders in some cases. There's also lack of ownership of some of these programs that are implemented. Conflict, until recently, had also been a major issue. There's also regional infrastructure deficiency, which is beginning to also change in recent times. And then the business environment has also not encouraged the countries to either invest among themselves or attract investment from other developing regions of the world. Now, in terms of the long-range prospect for regional integration in Africa, like I said at the onset, I strongly believe the future is very bright. Bright because several initiatives, most of the countries, or even at a regional level, the African Union, has now recognized what the major challenges are for regional integration efforts. And they're beginning to take action to ensure that they tackle this. So here I discussed just a few of these initiatives that are going on currently and the extent to which these could shape the future of South-South cooperation, not just intra-African, but between Africa and other developing countries of the world. One of them is AU's bold step to come up and say, we are banning additional or new regional integration, regional economic communities. So there is currently a protocol initiated between AU and all the existing recognized regional economic communities and say, stop, we don't want to hear about forming new regional economic communities or arrangements. And that has been helping. So there are efforts on the way now to rationalize the existing ones, to see how they can fit in together, to work more closely to promote regional integration in the region. And the second one also is that most of the countries are beginning to also learn on how to tackle some of the challenges that are emerging that could threaten regional integration in the region. And one of these was the action ECOWAS took by developing what they call revised treaty that comes again to tell the countries about the importance of the integration and what are their expectations in terms of making it work. Also, emerging issues like conflict. ECOWAS, I don't know, I stand to be corrected, is the only regional economic agreement in the world that has a standby army aimed at combating conflict, and this is with the aim to improve regional integration in the region. Then there's also been regional, cross-border investments in recent times. Nigeria and South Africa have been leading this process. There's almost no West African countries you go these days where Nigerian banks are not investing there. And this is also helping to shape the phase of payment systems within the region, which could also be a factor that will improve on regional integration arrangement. Then there's also successful harmonization of payment systems, then regional infrastructure development. We mentioned in the paper a few of these initiatives that are going on. There's also increased BITs and DTTs that have been signed between Africa and a few of these other countries. So with all of this coming up, I strongly believe that the future of regional integration is bright. But to cap it up, we make a few of policy recommendations that are all shown in the paper. And I guess that's all I can take for now. Thank you.
Good afternoon. The title of my talk is Economic Relations between GCC and India, and I believe I should first explain both of these because they might be strange to you. GCC refers to it's the abbreviation for Gulf Cooperation Council, which represents 6 small countries in the southern edge of the Persian Gulf: Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain. These countries together, their population now is somewhere around 36 to 38 million, which is almost a little over 1/10 of the population of the Arab world. And you might wonder, why am I focusing on such a small portion of the Arab world? Well, when you look at the GDP of these countries compared to the Arab world as a group, they account for almost 50% of GDP, and even a little bit more than 50% of the trade, external trade of the region. And that's due to the fact that a large amount of the world reserves of oil and natural gas are concentrated in these 6 countries. And because of that immense amount of oil and natural gas reserves, these countries are very important globally. Major industrial countries all over the world are interested in developing economic relations with the GCC countries. What about India? India is a phrase that was popularized by an Indian economist a few years ago. It refers to China and India combined, and they are, of course, important because they, as you know, they have been growing rapidly in the past 2 decades, more recently in India, but past 2 decades for China as well. So the 2 regions are important. And what we observe is that in recent years, there has been a mutual attraction between these 2 regions. And I'm going to address the reason for this mutual attraction and how it looks like. I need to find out where I am. Let me close this. Okay. So first, let me start by I hope this works well. This is fine. I'll just keep it like this. Showing you some statistics about how the relation between these 2 regions, how economic relation has evolved. As you can see, here we have the GCC trade with India, and notice that the growth in relations between India and GCC has really begun after year 2000, and it has been very significant. The volume of trade was well under $5 billion, both exports and imports, but it grew to close to $49 billion for exports of GCC to India, and about a little more than $30 billion for imports of GCC from India by year 2008. Of course, I'm focusing on 2008 because that was the year when the price of oil peaked almost to $150 per barrel, and the GCC countries had significant amount of oil and gas revenues. The condition has changed. There has been a reduction in volume of trade because the price of oil has declined. Price of oil declined from an average of well over $100 in 2008 to a low of almost $30 in April of 2009, and it has been recovering, of course, after that. Okay. Now China. A similar story for China, and again, we see the growth of both exports and imports after year 2000. A slow growth before that, but significantly larger after that. And the one difference between the trade with China and India is that you notice that here the trade deficit or the trade gap is relatively smaller. During the period 2000-2008, looks like at the same time that China was rapidly increasing its imports of oil and natural gas from GCC countries, it was also able to sell a significant amount of goods, and primarily goods, to the region. So the imports and imports are growing at the same pace. When we look within GCC countries, these are the 6 GCC countries, we notice that most of the trade in GCC if we look at trade with China, is concentrated in two countries, United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has now grown to one of the largest exporters of oil to China. The share of Saudi Arabia in China's imports in 2009 was 14%. 14% of China's oil imports came from Saudi Arabia. With UAE, as you notice, what is large is the value of UAE's imports from China. And that is large because UAE serves as a re-export hub for the entire Middle East region. Significant amount of Chinese goods that come into UAE come into Dubai, which is an international trade hub, and they are re-exported to countries like Iran, Central Asia, and rest of the Middle East. Similarly, trade with India, again, we see that bulk of it is concentrated in UAE and Saudi Arabia. Compared to and of course, I should mention that UAE and Saudi Arabia really account for well over 85% of the economic activity in GCC. They are the largest ones. Saudi Arabia primarily oil, and UAE a combination of oil and non-oil economic activity because of Dubai, which has been able to successfully diversify its economy. Now the question is whether the share of China and India in GCC trade have increased. This is significant because Europe and United States are also competing for the market, the GCC market, both in terms of exports and imports. And as you can see here, for Saudi Arabia, we see that the shares of India and China both have increased. And China has become one of the largest trade partners of Saudi Arabia as far as imports are concerned. And in 2008, Chinese share of GCC, of Saudi imports, exceeded United States. I haven't shown US and Europe in this graph, but if we look at the data for the market shares of United States and Europe, they have been steadily decreasing, whereas China has gained market share. However, this pattern is not unique to GCC countries. If you look at market shares of US, Europe, and China in Latin America, in Africa, you observe a similar pattern. So this I cannot say that this is unique to the region. It's the result of the fact that China has emerged as the manufacturing powerhouse for the entire planet. And of course, here you see the shares of China and India from United Arab Emirates, and a similar story again, a significant rise in relative share of China and India, and it's even larger than Saudi Arabia. So this is the statistical picture. And now the question is why this phenomenon has happened, and why has it accelerated after year 2000? Probably somewhere between 2001 and 2003. Well, a number of factors have contributed to this. First of all, China was self-sufficient in both China and India were relatively small consumers of oil up until 2000. After year 2000, their demand for oil has increased significantly. So they have actively pursued to find sources of oil, which has meant that China, for example, has commissioned its 3 oil companies to go abroad, go to Africa, go to Latin America, come to Middle East in search of oil. And their strategy is to sign long-term oil contracts. So it's very natural to think that China and India both are in need of oil, therefore they need the GCC region. And the GCC itself has been eager to expand its relation with China and India for 2 reasons. First of all, after 9/11, GCC countries, especially Saudi Arabia, have realized that their trade relations with the United States and Europe is vulnerable to political developments, adverse diplomatic developments. And also they see that North America and Europe are actively and aggressively trying to diversify their sources of energy. Yet at the same time, we observe that China and India have expanded their consumption, and it's expanding very rapidly. So from Saudi point of view, China and India are really good long-term customers. That's one reason. Another reason for this mutual attraction is that Saudi Arabia and other GCC countries have significant amount of oil surplus that they want to invest. Investing those in the West was common up until recently, but for political reasons and also for economic reasons, they are trying to diversify their investments. And to do so, they are looking east. This is a common phrase that you hear in Middle East. They are looking at opportunities in Asia, India, and in India, China, and other Asian countries. Another reason for this mutual attraction, the manufactured products of China are very competitive. GCC countries need to expand their the economies. They need significant amount of machinery and capital, and the best products that they can find with competitive price are products that they get from China. How much time do we have now?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay. Therefore, we have seen this expansion of a relationship between these countries. However, I'd like to point out some of the specific issues with respect to the relations between these countries. One of the interesting points that I hope it will generate some debate is that I think the reason GCC countries, which are very small, feel comfortable into expanding their relations with China and India, and especially their investment relations, is that they are enjoying a security and protection guarantee by the United States, which allows them to bargain and go worldwide and do all kinds of investments. The investment strategy of Saudi Arabia and China is interesting. China is investing in the energy sector of Saudi Arabia and other GCC countries in upstream, helping them develop their gas and oil supply. And Saudi Arabia, in turn, also some of other of GCC countries, are investing in distribution and downstream in China and other Asian countries. For example, Saudi Arabia is a partner for development of a refinery and also a very large distribution chain. What is the implication of that? These, I think, are going to set the region for long-term mutual dependency, because a country like Saudi Arabia has a heavy oil which can only be refined in certain types of refineries. And Saudis are building a refinery in China which can process their own oil. This means that in the long run, China and Saudi Arabia are locked into a long-term relationship, which means that, in my view, in the long run, the relation between GCC and China is one of those South-South relations that is likely to endure because of these steps that are being taken now and because of the complementarity of the products of these two regions. Thank you.
These are terrific papers. It does seem like we get to go from the broad conversation to let's look at specific regions. Let's look at the devils are always in the details, and you three have done a masterful job of looking at details within 3 very distinct regions. So let's open up for discussion. I'm going to take chair's prerogative and I'll ask one question. We'll take a bunch of other questions. Okay, y'all can think about your questions meanwhile. So my question is, how does regional integration increase the power of the poorest countries within these regions? So to what extent is Honduras benefiting from these changes, or Bolivia? Or is this really just the middle?
Microphone, please.
We don't have microphones. So louder. Louder. Okay. So, so to what extent are poor countries able to go along on the coattails of the richer countries within these regions, whether it's Honduras or Mozambique or Yemen? How come Yemen's not in the GCC? And how come Saudi Arabia is not doing investments in Yemen instead of in China?
Because Yemen is poor.
So we'll take say 4 questions, come back, let you answer, and then take another 4. Go ahead. Introduce yourself.
Franz from Madagascar. My question is that they have two questions. First, for the Latin American speaker, is the political stance by some South American country against the United States. Will it help the soft trade and investment increase, or it just stay at the political stage? And in the Africans, that you said that the economic preferential agreements that European and African have signed are in the way to sign definitively. You say that it have helped to rationalize the economic group, the creations of a regional trade body. But what I say that because during this stage, it has pinpointed the disparity of African countries' interest, because the Europeans, they have done some shopping because they have going through the SADC, COMESA, they've gone through the group rather than going directly for all Africans and Britain African ones. And lastly, because I've already talked about it before, is that how do you think that the impact of these soft economic relations have been on the difference and disparity between French-speaking countries, English-speaking countries, and Arab-speaking countries? Does it help, or this difference still stand right now? That's your perspective about that. Thank you.
Kevin?
Hi, my question is for Laura Gomez-Mera. Mera?
Yes.
You didn't touch much on the on this Bank of the South, which seems to be a bit of a mystery, but it is pitched as the alternative, a South-South bank, which is an alternative to the IMF and the World Bank and so forth, that is being run by Latin American countries. And so to what extent is this still a significant effort after the financial crisis? And if it is, to what extent will it really be much different than, say, the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank, more specifically?
Gentleman here in the blue shirt?
I think my question will be answered in session 4, so I'll wait.
Okay.
Wait until session.
Go ahead.
My question is directly towards Eric.
Why don't you wait for the microphone, please?
So thank you very much. Okay. So when we talk about trade agreements or trade, we assume it is good, like comparative advantage or economic growth. But the beneficiary of trade is not evenly distributed within the society. And in China, it's a very extreme case that there is divergence of the rich and the poor within the society. So what is trade in Africa, which you're very optimistic of going to affect within the African nation societies between the rich and the poor, and what do you think African countries can take from the previous experiences of other countries based on its own conditions? Thank you.
Okay, one more question, and then in the back, right there, okay? And then we'll take answers. We'll start with Laura. Okay.
Hello, I'm Siani Gordon from Costa Rica, and my question is, how do you see the rest of Central America and the Caribbean in a trading policy? At least Costa Rica had already signed with China, if I'm not mistaken, so I'd like to know, how do you vision the rest of Central America and the Caribbean, because you mentioned South America and North America, but not Central America. Thank you.
Okay, Laura, why don't you start?
Okay, thank you. I'll start with your question. How do regional integration agreements increase the power of poorest countries in these regions? And I think, in theory, two things. If we're looking at South-South cooperation agreements, in theory, one of the objectives was to increase the power of all participating members. In practice, they've been, especially, for example, Mercosur, where there's very wide, very important asymmetries between the bigger partners, Argentina and Brazil, and the smaller partners, Uruguay and Brazil. There weren't in place mechanisms to provide some redistribution or to make the balance of gains from cooperation and economic integration a bit better. Recently, there's been an attempt to create a structural convergence fund, which was a mechanism to achieve that. Many of the agreements, the regional cooperation agreements, the customs unions do have exceptions and exemptions for the smaller countries. My sense is that they haven't been very successful in increasing the power of the smaller. In fact, I think that they have allowed bigger countries to become more powerful. I argue in the paper that perhaps the fact that there's all these different agreements emerging allows the smaller countries to perhaps increase their bargaining leverage or power. For example, when Uruguay would threaten to leave Mercosur or sign a preferential agreement with the U.S. that would to some extent put pressure on Brazil and Argentina to pay attention to their demands in terms of compensation or a more balanced distribution of gains. I think the other trend that I emphasize in my paper of the proliferation of bilateral trade agreements with developed countries, I mean, a deeper empirical analysis is needed, but some of the literature that I've read believes or notes that they haven't been very, very positive for the smaller countries. Their developmental effects have not been very positive. The second question, which was about whether the political stance against the U.S. Was helping South-South relations. You mentioned economic relations. Well, what I argue in the paper is that to some extent there's different strategies toward the U.S. by different Latin American countries. Some of them choose to bandwagon the smaller countries. The others have chosen to balance and create competing projects. But in terms of economic relations, the two main more political groups that have emerged, the ALVA and UNASUR, have emphasized the non-economic, well, not necessarily non-economic. UNASUR does take into account commercial and a broader idea of economic integration, but it hasn't gone very far in terms of promoting economic integration. So that remains still to be seen. And the ALVA, and I think could also be tied with the other question about the Bank of the South. And one of the things that I was going to say in response to your question is that even though also, again, trade is not a priority, and there is a deliberate attempt to differentiate itself from the trade-driven agreements of the 90s. But there's been a lot of emphasis on financial cooperation and the Bank of the South, which in theory sounds like a very good idea, and it, in a way it would replicate what East Asian countries tried to do after the East Asian crisis. Latin American countries were not that successful in putting together or implementing financial cooperation, and I think it would be good. In practice, it hasn't gone that far, as much as I know, but there has been definitely cooperation, for example, between Venezuela and Argentina. That's been very important for Argentina and the Kirchner government, which shows and highlights the other aspect of economic cooperation that is working, and it is based on that type of opposition to the U.S., which is more political and ideologically driven. And the last question, yes, I didn't speak much about Central America, but I do cover it in the paper. I talk about the CARICOM and Central American Common Market, and also about the bilateral agreements that the countries in this region signed with the U.S. and also with other countries outside the region, as you very well note. And I think Central America is one of comparing to other blocs, it's been doing quite well in terms of inter-regional trade. Of course, they also, well, as you know, they signed the agreement with the U.S. I think they have benefited from this proliferation of agreements because of their trade structure. They have and their economies. They are from the group that has found it in its interest to cooperate with the United States as opposed to, and in a way they take advantage of that. South American countries have been more ambiguous, and there's been more differences within South America in terms of country strategies. I'm not sure I'm answering your question though. Thank you.
Eric.
Okay. Well, the first question has to do with the issue of the relationship, the North-South kind of agreement and the extent to which it affects intra-regional agreements. What I said in the paper and what I think I said here is that it has increased the complexity. And that's what I have in mind, because as you're trying to grapple with the several intra-regional agreements you also have to take into consideration the one you have with the North. So it increases the complexity and also weakens the extent to which the countries among themselves could really integrate. And then the question of Anglophone, Francophone, and the extent to which that has also influenced regional integration. Actually, it's only in the Western Africa within ECOWAS where we have these problems, and it's been a very big problem. There's no question about that. Because currently, that has been one of the factors why the region has not been able to progress towards a single currency agreement, because you have UEMOA, which already has an existing single currency going on, and then we have the second block, which we call the West African Monetary Zone, which is the English-speaking, who are making efforts now to. In fact, they have not even gone far with respect to macroeconomic convergence. So that becomes an issue, but the intention is to have these two currency arrangements, and they ultimately merge the two together to have a single one, the currency which they propose they will call ECO. But so far it's been a very big challenge. And then the third question has to do with the issue of how will regional integration affect the rich-poor kind of relationship within Africa. Of course, it's just like globalization, because it involves giving up some sovereignty, some liberalization policies, and so on. And if you do that, some will gain and some will lose in the process. So what needs to be done is managing the process. And within ECOWAS, which I'm very familiar with, they have a certain fund which they create. I think they call it Community Development Fund or so. And the idea of the fund is to be able to compensate the countries that are gaining, will contribute more into the fund, and they use that to compensate for the countries that are losing in the process. So I guess that's the best that can be done to ensure that you manage the situation and ensure that people who lose don't lose too much, and those who are gaining also pay a little back to compensate for those who are losing.
Well, there wasn't any question from the floor, but I'll address your question with respect to poverty and who will benefit from it. This question of how, for example, a country like Yemen can benefit from richer Arab countries is not related to GCC-China relationship, but rather in internal economic relations among Arab countries. And in the Arab world, there has been several attempts to achieve economic integration, even political integration, by the governments, but all of these government initiatives have failed. Yet at the same time, in the past 6-7 years, something new is happening. Without any government intervention, market forces are creating a situation where some banks, financial centers in Dubai, for example, are investing in other Arab countries. So Dubai is serving as a recycling center for Arab capital. The capital of wealthy people in Egypt, in Morocco, in other places, which used to be deposited in Europe, they have put them in banks and financial centers in Dubai, and those centers are now using that to invest in Arab countries. And I think this is a positive development which is driven simply by market forces and without any planning by the countries. Beneficiaries of that are countries like Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, and most of the money is going into real estate, tourism development, which has had some positive impact on the region.
How about we open up to a few more questions? Catherine?
I have a couple of different questions, one of them for Eric, for starters. You talked a lot about trade inside Africa, and I've actually been paying more attention to sort of Africa and then outside. And one thing that's quite interesting to me is that South Africa tends to be the voice for Africa in larger groupings. Like it's Africa's representative to the financial G20, for example, and it's in IBSA. And so from, I think, outside, there's often a presumption that South Africa can in some way speak for the economic interests of the region. Now, there's nothing in your presentation at all to suggest that South Africa deserves that role. And so I would be interested in having you talk about sort of how you think South Africa came to that position and whether you see an economic reason for that other than it being sort of the simplest thing for countries outside to do, which may be the reason why it happens. And then, Laura, I have a question for you that has to do with your characterization of sort of different epochs of trade agreements, with some of them being from a more liberal time period and then some post-liberal projects. One thing that I find rather interesting is that you do find a number of Latin American countries that are members of both kinds of projects, so that you can find countries in the Caribbean, for example, that are both members of ALBA and CARICOM. And those are really different kinds of trade projects. And I wonder how you think about that. And I guess in some ways, this also, as long as I have the microphone, I'm going to just keep talking. But I mean, it kind of raises a larger question to me that came about listening to the last talk, Nader's talk about China or Chindia in this relationship. And I was very struck because I think 2000 is a really important year in South-South trade. And in Latin America, we tend to think it's important because the 2000s are about the rise of the left and the post-liberal projects, and we see a real political motivation for the rise of South-South trade. Now, you gave it entirely an economic interpretation. And so I would sort of like to pose for the group as a whole this issue about political motivations for South-South trade, economic motivations for South-South trade, and whether there's any good way of thinking about all of South-South trade and these different motivations for it.
Great. Mariana?
My question goes to Nader Habibi, and it's related somehow to the fact I'm curious to know whether the GCC has undertaken any efforts to diversify other than Dubai in terms of the investment it receives and it makes, because it seems that very much is related to oil and basically, well, from Mexican perspective, we know that oil dependence is in the long run unsustainable. So I'm curious to know about that.
Alcides.
Alcides Vaz, University of Brazil. It's not really a question, but a short comment to Laura Gomez. As I've been also studying regional integration in Latin America, I couldn't resist going through your paper while flying to Boston. And there was one aspect of it that drew my attention, and I would like to share that with you. It's hard to make some sense out of the spaghetti ball of regional trade agreements, and that's the job we've been trying to do, to figure out some sense of the whole bunch of regional trade agreements existing in the Western Hemisphere and in Latin America as well. And I think that we must differentiate what's in the spaghetti ball. And we're talking of preferential agreements, we're talking of trade liberalization agreements that are focusing on intra-regional trade. Those trade liberalization agreements celebrated with third parties, economic cooperation mechanisms, and finally, regional political institutions that serve as a forum for political dialogue on economic issues. So, when you assess the impact of the three variables you're dealing with, the cross-institutional strategy, competition, okay, I think that if you try to portray or to discuss these three variables separately according to each set of instruments, maybe you can come out with a more precise focus on what their impact have been in spurring regionalism. For example, Perhaps cross-institutional strategies may be more functional for preferential agreements or those trade liberalization agreements celebrated within the Western Hemisphere, focusing on intra-regional trade. And perhaps competition might be more important when we consider especially those bilateral agreements celebrated with third countries. Okay, so I think it's just a matter of narrowing the focus on the kind of spaghetti you are considering at very specific moment of your analysis, rather a suggestion, a comment than a question.
Okay, before Laura gets to fettuccine versus capellini, we'll take one question from Adil, and then we'll take response. I think we'll start from Nader first, coming back.
Thank you all for wonderful presentations. My question, I'll direct it at Nader, though it can easily fit into the others, and if they have anything to add on this, I'll appreciate. But I'll just focus on Nader's paper. I think you ask a very interesting question, and a very pertinent question with the GCC. You know, why did this happen when it happened in the 2000? It being the growth of India's influence in terms of relations. As soon as you put that question, I was thinking, maybe there's a related question that also you might want to ponder upon or say more about. You do actually in the paper, but more about, which is what happens to GCC? And this is sort of my theme since morning. Sort of we focus on the first South more than the second. So, or the same is true for Latin America or for Africa. So because of this increased investment and the type of investment it is the GCC a different place than it might have been? And if so, how? Good, bad, or ugly, whatever it might be. And that seems to me to be one interesting question. We tend to do this a lot, I think, sort of particularly with China, sort of, because China bashing is a sport of great preference these days. Anyhow, we tend to focus on what China is doing, and I keep asking myself, what is the impact of whatever it is doing on those countries from their perspective? Catherine started answering that part. A number of papers did. Kevin does later in his. But I was wondering if you could say something about that. The other, and again I apologize for keep bringing this up, but more for the GCC paper than any other. I would like to hear your thoughts on sort of the non-trade, non-investment economic relations. I'll repeat the argument I alluded to this morning. I would argue that GCC's greatest influence on the economies of the South is through labor movements. That the economy of my country, Pakistan, is different because there are so many Pakistanis working in the GCC. I would imagine that similar for Philippines. I would imagine it similar for parts of Africa. And we tend to forget that. But we tend to think of trade and FDI as too more important.
Thank you. Who would you like to start? Yeah. Very well. Well, thank you for the questions in this round. Why is 2000 significant? I would say, if you look at the data, it's not that something important happened in the year 2000, maybe in the period 2000-2003, that really began that process of jump. Part of it, I think, is political. The tensions between Middle East and United States it kept growing, and then they came to a climax in September 11. When you look at China and relations between China and the Middle East, there is no historical baggage. So there is this clean slate, and so there is goodwill towards each other. So once you have a potential trade partner that can offer a variety of goods that you can purchase from them, and you don't have this history of colonialism, imperialism, and other tensions, it's natural that you're attracted to trade with that country, because trade is not value neutral. We not only care about what we buy, but we care about who we buy it from, as an individual, as a private company, and as a government. We know about that. So I think part of it was that diplomatic developments in years 2000 to 2003. It's not just September 11, it was also the Intifada, the Palestinian Intifada, which caused significant adverse opinion towards the United States in the Arab world, so this negative attitude was building up, whereas China is a country that remains neutral. It does not interfere in domestic affairs. It does not offer opinions about domestic affairs of its partners. That might not be very good in some cases, but for at least for the governments, it's a positive attribute of your trade partner that doesn't criticize you for anything. And then another factor is that we tend to think of China as being the producer of labor-intensive, low-quality manufactured products. But something was changing in China as well during 1990s. China was gradually moving towards more sophisticated products. And as a result, the diversity and complexity of the type of products that China was able to offer have increased. Therefore, it's again, it makes economic sense for the Arab countries, like other developing countries, to purchase more from China than from developed countries. The range of goods that they can purchase, it's cost beneficial. Addressing your question, whether the GCC countries are trying to diversify. Dubai diversified its economy because it had very little oil to begin with. And in United Arab Emirates, each emirate has its own separate economic affairs. So they really had no choice but to go towards diversification. Other countries have become concerned about the potential dangers of dependence on oil. They have tried to diversify. Many of them have gone into petrochemicals, aluminum products. These are the kind of products in which having cheap energy offers an advantage. So they have moved in that direction. But another positive development in these countries is that despite the fact that they could have simply relied on their oil and distribute the oil as a rentier state, we see that they are moving towards some very positive and substantial economic reform. Saudi Arabia, for example, has reformed its regulations, its financial system, and in 2009, Saudi Arabia received $36 billion in FDI, which made it the 8th largest recipient of FDI. Now, this is a country that receives significant amount of oil revenue, but it's attracting capital from abroad. Why it's happening? Because it has created a hospitable environment for investment. So that's some of the steps that are being taken. And the last question that you mentioned, I think you mentioned two questions. What is happening in GCC as a result of trade? I think it's not just trade, it's also investment relationship with GCC. And also the strategic value of expanding your economic ties with GCC, which for these small countries gives them more bargaining power with the United States and Europe. Currently, Europeans are negotiating with GCC for a free trade agreement. China is also negotiating. India is negotiating. Everybody wants to have relations with GCC countries. And having this diverse number of clients and customers gives you more bargaining power. What about non-trade, non-investment relations? And you're referring to labor relations. GCC countries are extremely dependent on foreign labor. In some countries, up to 85% of the residents are foreign workers. For example, a country like Qatar, with a population of 1.2 million, more than 800,000 of them are foreign workers, many of them from South Asia. Saudi Arabia has about 5 million foreign workers. So it is important for the economy of the region to have these workers because of the domestic shortage of labor. And also it's a source of income for these countries. However, the amount of pay to these workers, especially low-skilled workers, is very low. Although it makes a difference in a poor village in India when somebody earns $300 and sends $200 home to his family. But if you look at labor rights and human rights of the workers, there are some issues to be considered about human rights conditions in these countries. The governments themselves, sure, I'll stop here and let others start.
Okay, yeah, I'll try to be as brief as possible. Well, the first question is that it looks as if my paper doesn't give so much importance to South Africa, and why? Well, I guess one challenge of analysis based on Africa is often that, especially non-Africans tend to aggregate the whole continent and assume it's one country, and individual countries are just states. It's a vast continent with different diversities. Within Africa itself, like I said in the paper, yes, within Southern Africa, South Africa has succeeded in having, it's a major player within the sub-region. There's no question about that. But if you're talking, for instance, about West Africa, though they're beginning to make inroads into other, especially Eastern Africa, and recently into Western Africa. But as at now, I mean, the influence is still very limited with respect to investment and with respect to trade within the country. Now, with respect to whether they deserve the role they are given, I mean, as the mouth of Africa, as it were, well, I would say, well, to some extent, yes. And it's because of the level of development. Relatively, in terms of development, it's doing better. It's more mature an economy than all of the African countries. Infrastructure is good. We also have to realize the leadership role of Mandela as a person is also a very big figure, which has also influenced the extent to which South Africa has emerged as a major player in terms of its representation of Africa. But if you speak to President of Nigeria, for instance, or Ghana, I'm not sure they will agree with that, because I remember, when they were developing the NEPAD, before they came up with NEPAD, there were lots of, Mbeki brought his own agenda, Wade from Senegal brought his Omega plan. Then Obasanjo from Nigeria also brought his own. It took a lot of effort before the then ECA executive secretary has to find a way to harmonize these three and make them agree, leave some, take some, and they came up with NEPAD, So if you ask in other countries, nobody will agree that this is my mouthpiece or so. But like I said, because of the maturity of the economy, because of the leadership, because of the level of development, it tends to be. Then the issue of, what African countries think or what individual countries think about the role of China in their economy. For Africa, I think African countries appears to be very comfortable with the relationship to some extent. Like I was discussing with some colleagues earlier before now, some of the commodities like mobile phone that could cost hundreds of dollars before, you can get it for just $10, $20. So people are happy about that, even though they complain about the quality. But at least you have a mobile phone, and that's a point. Then the infrastructure they also tend to develop is also a very good plus. Some countries, they construct roads, even though it will be for some few years and it goes bad again. But at least for now, you have some good roads you can work with. In the next stage, we can think of improving the quality, you understand? So recently, I think just yesterday or so, Ghana, I think the president of Ghana is still in China now. They got about $30 billion loan from China, and they say, okay, they will invest some in the oil sector, they will invest some in infrastructure, and so on. So they appear, the ease with which they can get this loan is also important to some of them. We know the nature of some of the governments in Africa. Some of them are dictatorial, some are military. So coming to Europe or the US to get loans will be difficult, multilateral institutions. But China doesn't look at some of those, economic governance indicators. If you need loan, you want loan. Okay, how much do you want? They give it, and they are fine with that. So that's the way to look at it. Some of the countries are just happy about it. They're comfortable with it, as it were. And the issue of intra-regional migration or labor movement. For me, I think that's one thing that has not been well researched, or maybe not researched, maybe not say not researched at all, not well investigated in Africa. When we were doing the China-Africa study, we tried to look at that. For instance, within Southern Africa, you have several Zimbabweans, you have several Botswanans, but nobody tends to look at this. Within West Africa, for instance, there are several Nigerians in almost all the countries, contributing very massively to economic production in in these other countries. But it just looks as if we tend to overlook that, rather look at north-south kind of migration and relationship. And I think that's an area that we really need to look at and see the extent to which this also could improve regional integration in the region. But then infrastructure also limits the extent to which you could move. Within West Africa, there are lots of protocols, free movement of persons, right of stay, and so on. But in most cases, like I said earlier, political will, they are not working. To live in Ghana as a Nigerian, for instance, you still need, you don't need visa to get in there, but you need a residence permit to live there. And there's some kind of discrimination too between your investment and the investment of a Ghanaian, yet there are protocols stating that so long as you're a member country citizen, you should live there freely and do business freely and also live there freely. So I think that also it's an important factor that tends to limit the extent to which people move across this region.
Yes, I'll start with this comment. Thank you very much. I think I totally agree that I need to consider different types of agreements and how some of them might be some of this cross-institutional strategies or competition effects might be more relevant for one or other. I'll do that for my final draft. And Catherine's question, yes, I do. I was running out of time, so I skipped all the political factors, but I completely agree that it has been very important in sort of shaping the changing landscape. And you have countries that in the 90s, that since the 90s have gone through important political changes, and that has also affected their trade insertion strategies. But also another thing, and definitely the shift to the left has been important in determining the choices that countries have made, and also how they've reacted to the U.S. in terms of their trade agreements. Another factor that I mentioned in the paper is the role of export lobbies and export-oriented interests, and how one of the arguments is that in some Central American countries, those so-called winners from asymmetric agreements have been much more organized and strong than conventional trade politics theories would predict. And so that has also given, and of course it is related to the structure of the economy and the type of exports and the political, what can be called the political trade dependence from the United States in some of those countries. But definitely I think it's important to look at the political aspect.
So thank you for 3 very informative papers and very thoughtful responses to people's questions.